Stephen Oliver, welcome to Bridging the Gap. How are you doing, my friend?
Good. Great to see you again.
Great to see you. We were just talking before we recorded. I mean, it's basically we're switching tables or switching sides of the table, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, yeah.
You had me. You were great, very kind to have me on your podcast, and I'm happy to have you here because I just found our conversation insightful, and I think you bring a ton to the community. So I'm excited to talk about everything from your experience of marketing and coaching and just the change you've seen in the industry over the years you've been in it. I think there's so much insight that we can all learn for what it means going forward. So I'm excited to dig into all of that with you here today. But before, I always like to get to know you, and I know that you're into you do a lot with the martial arts community nowadays. But I always to learn more about individuals. I always like to ask the question of what did the 13-year-old Stephen Oliver want to be when he grew up?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I kind of floated between I wanted to be a rock concert promoter and a world kickboxing champion. So I was thinking that my path in martial arts was going to be competition, and then I worked my way through college, working with a stable of world championship level people, and figured out that was a really hard way to make a living, and shifted gears pretty quickly. But interestingly, especially in high school, I was very interested in music, not so much as a musician, but I was managing a band, promoting events at my high school, one thing or another. So I really thought I was going to be end up being in that industry back at that period of time. Then I went to Georgetown, got a degree in economics, thinking I was going to end up on Wall Street.
I mean, those are I can see the synergies of the two, rock, rock concert promoter and economics. I mean, there are some economics there, but
Yeah.
but tell us more about that journey, right? Going from being really into music to now finding yourself at Georgetown into economics and ultimately into wealth management. I mean, what walk us through that kind of progression through the journey of life there.
Well, I think to a great extent it was, I got a love of economics in my first couple years in college. I wasn't too sure what my major was going to be, but I really started looking at it and decided if I wanted to be at Harvard or Stanford or Wharton for an MBA, it was a good undergraduate. So that really was the logic at the time. And as I ended up, I worked my way through college teaching karate, running a martial arts school, and I figured out that it wasn't the technical skill set that was really the missing ingredient for most people. It was the getting out in the community, getting the name recognition, getting the marketing, and I happened to be kind of in even that side, born with a silver spoon in my mouth, see if I can say that properly. But the organization I was working with was a multi-million-dollar operation, biggest probably in the world. And the head of that organization was truly a genius at marketing. He was teaching everybody from Muhammad Ali to, the coach of the Redskins. I mean, you can go through a list. Then Tony Robbins, etc. But he was the instructor for Congress. He was in the Washington Post on all the major TV stations all the time. All the way to in one of his deals, he ended up on CNN Worldwide every 30 minutes for 24 hours. So he was just a genius at connecting with celebrity, becoming a celebrity, creating a reputation in his area. And I figured out pretty quickly working for him that, that really was part of the secret sauce of the success that he was having. But of course, that cuts across all kinds of lines.
I want to dive into that in a second after I ask this next question because like that idea of how he went about or that mentor went about creating celebrity status and getting integrated in
Yeah.
that way. I think there's something there that we can all learn from in
Oh,
terms of
absolutely.
marketing. But before we get to that point, I want to continue kind of on this reflective state of looking back. You've been doing coaching and consulting within wealth management for 22 25 years almost, and
Yeah.
that's a long time. You've seen a lot, right? I just think about what's evolved within our industry, where we were just say in 2000 relative to where we are
Yeah.
now. it's
Yeah.
um it's pretty drastic. I'm curious from your standpoint, um How have you had to evolve the strategies and the insights you've utilized for coaching and consulting over that period of time? What have been some of the biggest, evolutions in your own practice, in your own strategies over those years? Because I just feel that you've had such a finger on the pulse for so long through some massive amounts of change within our industry.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I guess I really stuck my foot into it to begin with. In 1999, I wrote my first book on internet marketing, as it applies to the industry. And if you took just that segment, of course, it's changed massively. When I wrote the book, Yahoo was the biggest source as a directory. Alta Vista, which is a non-entity now, was the search that you were trying to work in. And as far as even buying clicks, it was the early days of GoTo, which became Overture, which became the inspiration for Google's business model. But the online world, of course, is changing every week. I mean, right now, even for my own business, we're suffering through new email regulations, new regulations with text messaging, new compliance issues for advisors on the back end with regard to all of that. So that's changed dramatically. I think probably the biggest tectonic shift that's happening is that more and more, as the world is moving faster and faster, it's very hard to be successful and be mediocre. It's very, very hard to be the same as everybody else. We have all the robo-advisor phenomenon that's been happening for a while, but now the AI phenomenon. And if you don't specialize, niche, and really stand out from the crowd, you're going to end up with people who do it themselves, online things that do it, or you're just going to be reduced to functionary and not really be seen as a professional expert.
Yeah, I think that the idea of just looking at marketing in general, how we market, especially on the digital side, has transformed. But then you think about, I think about kind of how you think about strategy for your firm relative 20 years ago to now, right? And you can think about marketing in a bucket, but just think about what you were mentioning with specification and niche, right? Yeah, I remember when we started our firm, it was all about just being an RIA and being independent. Like that was your
Right.
differentiator. And then you
Yeah.
were just serving anybody and everybody that would come to you, and people wanted just to go to someone that was independent. And now we've evolved to the side of saying you've got to be focused on a specific narrow niche and segment, which you can't be broad. You got to be narrow, which is what they've been talking about in the SaaS world forever. With the technology world, you got to figure out what your niche is and go
Mhm.
serve that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, transitioning into this marketing bucket because that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time, and we're going to talk about niche marketing and having a niche in a little bit. But talk to me about that mentor you mentioned, what you learned from him regarding becoming celebrity. Like, what was it about the networking and getting out there and in creating a name for yourself, which I think is so valuable for us to learn in this industry, where we are the business to some extent, right? That's the beauty of this business. That is the moat, is the relationship aspect of it, and it's a matter of how do you get your name and your value of your firm and of you out there more extensively. So, what were some lessons learned from that individual that you think can translate over to the people and advisors in the industry today?
Well, I was relaying this to one of my associates just a couple days ago, and you know how it is with mentors and teachers of all ilk. Oftentimes, when you're getting the greatest advice from them, is not at the point that you're open to listening and hearing the best advice. And one of the points that he told me years ago was always use your name. Don't try to hide behind a corporate facade. And I at the time kind of discounted that and did the opposite. And it was kind of like the teenage son ignoring the dad in the sense of the way I was hearing, the advice. I would say I was really good at watching what they were doing and picking up on the details. And when given direct, very valuable advice, oftentimes discounted it. But that was one of the things. The other thing, in just watching, in this case, his name was Jun Ri. He's a Korean American who was also known as the father of American Taekwondo. But one of the things that I noticed about him is, if you want to use the word opportunistic, he was very opportunistic in the sense of He was very good at watching what was going on and finding where the opportunities were. And just one story is, Washington, D.C., when I was living there years ago, was the murder capital of the world, or at least of the U.S. It was pretty bad. But there was a situation where a congressman was mugged. And June Reese sees this in the paper, and then another incident where what would you call an ambassador had a similar situation. So the minute he saw that in the newspaper, he immediately reached out and contacted the person about teaching them martial arts. And well, congressmen like publicity. So it was a marvelous opportunity for this congressman to get the story of being mugged and then doing something about it into the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC. But it led him into a foot in the door, and he ended up being the official instructor for Congress for 50 years. Taught everybody from H.W. Bush to Joe Biden to Newt Gingrich, all along the line. But I think that's something that is hard for people to do, is to watch the news, watch the environment, and figure out where their opportunities are. One of the best ways to get press is to jump on top of the story that's already going on. As you well know, producers aren't trying to screen people out. What they're trying to do desperately is find experts on whatever the current news story is, and so find somebody to talk to. They have a hard time doing that. That's a rough job. So if you're paying attention to what's going on and finding opportunities where you're a perfect fit, it's a sure foot in the door. The other thing, by the way, he was very good at is attaching himself to celebrities, and then by way of that, becoming a celebrity. There's a great old video of him receiving an award from Bob Hope. And it was Wilt Chamberlain and Muhammad Ali both receiving an award at the same time. And he took the opportunity to challenge Ali and challenge Wilt Chamberlain while getting the award from Bob Hope. It was one of those, just priceless moments. But of course, it endeared him to Ali and Chamberlain and Bob Hope. But it then became its own little secondary news story.
Did they accept the invitation to to whatever he was challenging them to, or did they pass?
Ollie became a student of his. So Ollie did in fact become a student of his. He, I mean, this is a long time ago now, but he had basically an MMA fight with a wrestler, and Junri taught him before that, and a couple of other things. And but the publicity that came across from everything from Junri taking him to Korea to having Muhammad Ali show up at events there in Washington was just phenomenal.
That's amazing. And you said something that you learned from observing him, and I think it is so true that we tend not to learn the lessons of our mentors or of just experiences until it's a little bit later, and we learn it the hard way, and then we're like, wow, we did learn this in the past, and we should have taken note of that. I can see that now being on the parenting side. I can see that very vividly of what I made mistakes on, but. One thing you mentioned was the ability to see what's going on in the world and find an opportunity to go there. And I wonder from your perspective, where do advisors stand on that spectrum of being able to see outside of the industry? I think sometimes, when I hear that, how I interpret it is I say, well, let's go look at what other companies and other industries and other businesses are doing and how they're doing it. And maybe it's not a one-to-one direct comparison, but there's something there we can learn from. And everybody likes to go to the Apples of the world, but like you think about like Patagonia or Costco or Chick-fil-A and what they're doing. And I found this to be so valuable to bring back and say, how can we do something similar, but that meets what we do? Where do we stand? How much do we have to grow as an industry to get to that point? And what are some ways that we can get better at that? How do we get out of our comfort zone to grow even more in that way?
Well, that's super important. Another mentor, Dan Kennedy, is a marketing guru type. He calls it marketing incest. Most people go into business, they look around at what everybody else is doing, do the same thing, which means you're just copying mediocrity. Go back a little further. Earl Nightingale famously said, if you go into a business and you don't have a successful business model, look at what everybody else is doing and do the opposite. And within, as you well know, within the industry, it's like everybody's doing a sameness contest. They're looking around what everybody else is doing and doing exactly the same thing in the industry. And all of the best tools that I've used, both for my own businesses and that I've shared with other people, are things I picked up from other niches. Sometimes fairly comparable, sometimes, as you said, Apple or Chick-fil-A or Costco or something like that. But if you're not constantly aware, I see a lot of times other service businesses. You go to the dentist, the doctor, some other service business, and off, unfortunately, 90% of the lessons you learn are exactly what not to do, right? But very often you can find examples of excellence and things that you can replicate and or figure out how it applies to you.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of, that come to mind, some companies that you think, and like, let's look at it from a marketing lens, right? Not necessarily like a doing business lens, but of a growing business lens. I'm curious on your side, when you look at it from a marketing, focus, what are some of those companies that just do it so well for their industry, right? That we can learn from your perspective. And I think about, I've done a lot of focus on this within the service side, and I think about, like, from a servicing standpoint, like Chick-fil-A is unbelievable. Peloton is unbelievable at their servicing and setting things up, right? I think about the ease of when you have an issue, like at American Express. I've had a ton of great success there. But that's from a servicing side. From a marketing standpoint, of doing a great job marketing and marketing to their people, whether you fall into their people or not, what are some examples that you've seen that just do it really well from your
I
perspective?
have a list of them, top of my tongue here, but I'll tell you one that probably might surprise a lot of people is Harley-Davidson. Harley-Davidson is just phenomenal from the standpoint of, and by the way, I joke that I'm a little into motorcycles, and I got hooked into going to a trip to Sturgis with several of my friends, and they were giving me grief about not being enough of a biker. But I rode my Harley to Sturgis and traded in for BMW. So I joked that I resigned from the cult of Harley Davidson into the cult of BMW. But Harley Davidson is better than any company I've ever seen at really pulling you into the cult once you get there. Of course, they have a demographics problem now. They same as many advisors is, their audience is aging out and they haven't quite gotten the 20 or 30 somethings in. But when you buy a Harley, I bought one, and I get this plaque with a picture of the bike that I bought, to put on the wall with a personalized plaque on the wall. But when you buy the bike, you're automatically inducted into the HOG membership. HOG stands for Harley Owners Group. And the HOG membership, every year you're getting these stupid pins and patches for your damn black jacket. So they're sending you road atlases, they're sending you invitations to events. They have these constant meetings and outings and one thing or another, as you're constantly getting these pins and one thing. But it really becomes this like little community within your city of people who are like that. Another company very similar to that is Porsche. I've had any number of nice cars. If you have a Mercedes or a Jaguar or a Cadillac or whatever it might be, you're not in anything special. Corvette comes kind of close, but with Porsche, everybody's waving at each other, and they're part of the Porsche Club, and there's Porsche Club outings, and there's all this stuff, and you want to create that environment of there's this special thing that you're involved with. It's unique. It's almost cultish. And I was having a conversation with one of my clients, and the number one reason why people quit advisors, I've seen the stats over and over and over again, is they just say they don't get communicated with enough, and it's some level of conversation, communication. But what do most advisors do? How they sign them up. They meet with them once or twice a year, and they don't have the outings, the club, the pins, the special things. It's one of those things that really can be replicated. Having lunches for clients, having Zoom meetings for clients, having all kinds of special events, activities. one thing or another. That should be something that's happening every month, preferably something going on every week.
I absolutely love that example. I never knew that about Harley at all because I'm not a biker. But to be able to learn that, right, the sense of community and the sense of value of even these like tchotchkes of these pins and these things to put, it creates this like that you're valued, and it creates this, to your point, this cult. And it kind of goes to the sense that, and I'm curious to know kind of your thought on this. I've been thinking a lot about this. Is that like, how do we make wealth management more experiential, right? How
Yeah.
do we make it more experiential? How do we create that cult and maybe create offshoots or niches that are focused on just specific people, whether it's riders or hikers or whatever it is, and create this sense of like, your own little, jacket patches or Letterman jackets, whatever it is that as you're guiding towards different things or putting on these events, because it's hard to put together events that are, when you're serving just maybe like a high net worth community, it's hard to figure out what events are going to attract to certain people. So you're going to get these like little kind of pockets. But if
Mhm.
you have, like you said, and this goes into our next conversation about niche, marketing and creating a niche and a target, is when you have that, you can talk to them and you can double down on that. And you don't have to worry about nobody being aligned, because people are aligned because they've raised their hand saying, I'm part of this cult or
Yeah.
community from that
Yeah.
standpoint.
Yeah.
So I'm curious on your side, have you seen wealth management firms do that? But more so, what are the steps necessary that a firm needs to go through to identify a niche and to make either that transition, if they've been around for a while, to get there, or if they're kind of stepping into a new venture to build out that niche community?
Well, I mean that's a question we could talk for a week about, right? But to narrow it down a little bit, I think number one is go from trying to be corporate facing to be a personality. And if it doesn't matter what the company is, no matter how well respected they are, is people don't talk about companies so much as they talk about people. Now, the Harley example, obviously, it's more of a branding of a thing, but um, I think that's number one. Is advisor firms tend to be this button down, conservative, no personality base whatsoever. But I would much rather know about your hobbies, what you're interested in. And, you said earlier, you don't talk about sex, drugs, or politics. Well, I got to tell you, I could create a base of people on any one of those subjects as well, right? I mean, I could create a base of people who are hyper liberal. I could create a base of people who are hyper conservative. I could create, um, and usually when we're talking about niches, what we're thinking about is industry niches, and that's the easiest thing, right? I mean, if I'm going to be the guy or gal for dentists, and I put together a bunch of dentists, it makes it easier to come up with interesting things to talk about, ways to be more holistic, ways to target them. Heck, if in any industry niche, I can go to the SRDS, Standard Rate and Data Service. I can figure out what all the industry niche magazines. I can figure out what mailing lists are available. I could become a columnist in their trade magazine. I could show up at their events. There's so many different ways to market once I've really defined the who of who I want to target. But then it gives me the ability to really be more conversational, fluid, be able to speak their language and bring things to them that are going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think that that's so key, and you mentioned this idea of, you know, not hiding behind like the company and being a personal brand and not a company brand. And you think about, Harley Davidson be different, but I think about like Apple, and I think about some of these other big companies. Like there was always a personal brand that drove
Mhm.
that brand initially. Then they got to a size that then the brand became its own. That's like the succession plan. But
Mhm.
there's a person that drives it initially. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak for Apple. You think Ray Kroc for for McDonald's, you think
McDonald's.
about the Kathy family for Chick-fil-A, right? Like there was people that they connected with the follower base, but then they ultimately built up such a following base that then they were able to move it on to the company. And we try to jump that because we only see the company side. We don't remember what it all got to.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that this is a relationship business, right? We're a relationship business. People connect to people. And so you have to create your personal brand. And so many people avoid that. And it's so easy to create your personal brand now with all the media outlets out there. And so I want to ask you from that standpoint. Let's say I'm an advisor. I'm coming in, I'm listening to this and I'm like, Steven, I'm all in. I agree. I've been hiding behind my corporate brand for too long. I want to start creating a personal brand. Steven, walk me through what that looks like. How do I need to think about my personal brand? Should I just go get on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and just start posting, or make my own blog? Like, what does that look like?
Well, let's step back on the transition for just a second. There, you were talking about. Yeah, let me give you an example. I find it interesting because it's kind of the opposite of what I would have done. I've been a big movie buff for years. Go to a lot of movies. I try to talk my son and previously my daughter before she moved to Seattle into all of the interesting ones. And one of the theater chains is United Artists. Well, the background on United Artists. Tell me what's more interesting. United Artists is a national chain, is part of the Regal Cinema brand now. But what's more interesting, United Artists, the way it got its name was it was Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and somebody else of that ilk. I forget. There was three of them that decided that their films weren't being seen in a quality enough environment and created their own theater chain, thus naming it United Artists because of Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And nowadays, 99.9% of people who go to United Artists Cinema have no idea the background. There's no signage in the building. There's no history of Charlie Chaplin, our founding, any of that stuff. Well, and I went to Dairy Queen recently. I don't go to Dairy Queen very often, but Dairy Queen did a really good job of creating this whole plaque and display of the evolution and where they came from and how they evolved. Now, if you look at the way that companies evolve, wouldn't United Artists be a lot better off to be featuring Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the reason why it was formed, what the the values of the founders were, how we're elevating that today? They would never have dreamed of Atmos, Dolby, or or the recliner seats, but we've taken. See, it becomes much more empowering. All of a sudden, I'm interested in the theater if they kept that founder story, right? And again, Apple's done a halfway decent job of keeping Steve Jobs, alive in some ways, but it's always a mistake to move into that corporate facing, right? Chick-fil-A, Kathy Truitt is a really interesting person, supported boys' homes, has a tremendous charitable outreach in one thing or another. With some of the political stuff, they moved away from that. I think that's a mistake, right? They should be putting the founder, who I think he's still alive, put him on the pedestal. His son has taken over. But just to go back to that one example, there really was a Harley and a Davidson, right? But there's so many stories, and you can see so many companies where IBM has become kind of a meaningless symbol. But Watson was an innovator at the same level as Musk or Jobs or many others. You see how much more engaging emotionally those stories are if you keep that.
You're so spot on. Like as you were talking, I started to connect myself. Like United Artists, I had no idea about that. I
Yeah.
connect more with them knowing those individuals, right? And I think that there's this like shift, whether it's a cultural shift in the world or a shift in corporate mindsets in the sense that they've got to move away. And I actually kind of experienced it a little bit of like the push and pull within our own organization. I mean, my dad founded our firm 27 years ago, 28 years ago. We're now 80 plus people in 5 cities, and
Mhm.
not everybody knows who dad was, and
Mhm.
and so it's like, well, do we get to just say, hey, we're CIA and this is the culture, or do we really continue to put him in the building of the founding up on it and the morals and the values that was created on?
Yeah.
And I can see how companies shift away because they think it's too amateur to continue to highlight this guy or gal or family from a past that nobody can connect with.
Yeah.
But in reality, that may be feeling right in the moment. I think it's detrimental longer term because we still are humans and we like connection.
Yeah.
And human to human connection is what it's all about. Having a connection to the human that built the firm and
Yeah.
started the firm, and the understanding of it is so key, I think, to that
Well,
point.
another example most people will remember is, remember when the Wendy's ads were done by the founder and the name of the company was his daughter, and ever since he passed away, and that has gone away, it's gone into decline. KFC had the Colonel, and they killed the Colonel. Of course, he was already dead before they killed him, and they brought him back in some interesting ways. I wouldn't say very well, but the worst thing they did is to distance themselves from the Colonel and to eliminate that branding. No, I think you're always better off to have a personality tied to it. Walt with Walt Disney stood for something. And so the other side of it, if you're an advisor in the middle of a big firm, though, how does that impact you? Well, and that's where we were going a minute ago before I got us distracted with that theater story. But I think you've got to start by being interesting, right? Is if you and most every advisor that I've ever met has hobbies. They have things that they're interested in. I'm not a fisherman, but I know a guy who's deeply into fly fishing, another one who's deeply into Porsches, another one. You go through the list. Wear your hobbies on your sleeve. You'll find other people who are a fan of the same university. This is tangentially different, but my first State Farm agent when I moved to Denver and I had my car insurance and everything, he was a Razorback fan. So he I don't remember if he had gone to University of Arkansas or one thing or another, but he had those stupid red pigs everywhere. They were on his business card. He had the thing on the deal, the suey, whatever the hell it is. I'm not a Razorback fan, but it was engaging. If something comes up over lunch, it's like, oh, you got to talk to John, and by the way, if you don't like the Razorbacks, just bear and deal with it because he's a fanatic. But it was something interesting about the guy, right? Now you go into most insurance offices, and what's interesting about it? Nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. There's no personality. There's nothing interesting whatsoever. I've got another one. It's actually the first financial advisor I started working with many, many, many years ago, probably 20 years ago now. But he's a Porsche fanatic. He's trying to collect every iteration of the Porsche 911 Turbo. And I keep trying to get him. Why don't we do the office with, we'll do the office warehouse with the glass wall, and you can have your collection over there. And then you have the conference room where you meet people, and you can become the columnist for the local, regional, national Porsche club. You can have live meetings at the dealership since you've spent 1.5 million with them over the years. It just writes itself, right? And, if I wasn't into Porsches, doesn't matter. He's interesting. There's something about the person that stands out, that's engaging. I keep forgetting his name, but you remember the lawyer who always wore the suede jackets with the tassels? Well, it's much better to stand out and be interesting. There's a financial advisor on Charles Payne's show, and some of it. He's always wearing like a multicolored glasses and all this crazy stuff. It wouldn't be my gig, I wouldn't want to be the clown, but I would want it to be where there's something interesting about me as a person, and that I'm sharing that with people, and even if it's a parent, it's better to be posting pictures of your kids and you're out at Disney with the kids and you're on the boat or whatever it is. That stuff makes you human as opposed to just a functionary. The worst thing in the world is just blend in like any other CPA or something like that and be milquetoast. It's the worst possible positioning.
You and I are both aligned on this. I just actually got finished writing a blog for my email newsletter that's going to go out in a couple weeks, and it's all about authenticity and the power of authenticity. But authenticity means that you have to be vulnerable. There needs to be vulnerability, and I think that there's this perception of what our professional persona is supposed to be, and we have to live in that box. And so if we go and show Pig Suey everywhere or Porsche everywhere, then we're not in that box of how people perceive us based on the perception of the world. And I think that's BS. And
Yeah.
that's BS. Like people are going to connect. You can only live that for so long, because you ultimately are going to revert back to who you are. And I think that being able to be vulnerable, to show your family, to talk about a stance, take a stance on something, for
Oh
crying
yeah.
out loud.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes people aren't going to like it, but we all want to be accepted, and we have this professional persona that if people don't like us, then our business is going to go down, and we're fearful of that. So we're just going to take the easy, the low risk route, and then we're just going to say content that everybody else is saying, and we're going to wonder why we're not being heard.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
because you're not being authentic.
You know, if you look at it, let's go back to politics. You know, let's take the U.S. president. Is They are single-handedly the most famous and the most powerful person in the world at any time, and you can absolutely guarantee that 40% of the population hates them at any one time. Doesn't matter who it is, right? It could be Clinton, it could be Obama, it could be Bush, it could be Trump, whoever it is, and you're absolutely guaranteed that 30 or 40% are going to love them at any one time. And I think it's a good example. In order to be highly attractive, to some extent, you've got to be polarizing. If there aren't people who go, "Oh, that's not my person," then there also aren't people who say, "Oh, that is my person. I really identify with them. I really like what they stand for." And again, you got to choose judiciously. You've got to make an informed decision on whether you want to, who do you want to repel, who do you want to attract. But once you make that decision, you've got to be authentic in how you're presenting all of those different pieces. And it's people are attracted to that. Again, one of the biggest problems in the industry is trust. The reason why people don't want to work with an advisor is they're afraid of, the various frauds, the Bitcoin thing, most recently, I guess, Bankman-Fried. But if you wear what you are on your sleeve, if you're engaged in your church, you're involved with your kids, you're thrilled about your hobbies, whatever it is, that comes across to people as a real human. That comes
Mhm.
across to somebody as they really know what you are, they like it or they don't like it, they're going to engage or they're not engaged. It's the single most important way to build trust is both showing people that you like them, which comes back to the communication side of things, and really showing them who and what you are, and attracting the ones that click with you, and repelling the ones that don't.
100% agree. I mean, we could talk about authenticity. We could talk about niche for forever. I wanted to be respectful of your time and the listeners' time, but I before we get into our two final wrap up questions, I want to ask this one question. And I want to, before we close out that last topic, I would just encourage people just to be vulnerable and try it and lean into what you are, and you'll be surprised at what happens. But before we get into the final wrap up questions, your book, Extraordinary Marketing for Financial Advisors,
Yeah, I got it here.
there it is, right there. Go out and get it if you haven't. It's a great no nonsense guide, which is all from your experiences of 40 years in the marketing side. But one of the aspects of it, you talk about accelerating growth. And you talk about some of the key takeaways that advisors can have to focus on that, and for like quick growth. I'm curious. I want to change that just for a second, thinking like in the James Clear mentality of Atomic Habits
Mhm.
and small 1% gains. What are, from your book and your learnings and your experiences, what are some of those things that advisors can start just doing every day? Those small little wins that aren't going to maybe make that like huge impact right away, but when you build them and stack them, it makes something drastic. What are some of those small things they can do every day?
I think one is, and this sounds kind of esoteric, but it's get in the habit of seeing opportunity all around you. And it's amazing. Three different people can walk around the block on any street, and one person sees 22 points of opportunity, the other one sees nothing, but the sidewalk, the Starbucks, and the parked cars, right? And so if you just get in the habit of asking yourself, what's the opportunity in this? What's the opportunity in this association, this person, this thing that's going on, and just pay attention. It's why you pay attention to the news. Is there's always news stories you can jump across if you wanted to get publicity. I really think that's number one is condition yourself to see opportunity rather than just seeing the normal world around you. Right? Always metaphorically put on new glasses and see what you can do that's going to be beneficial. I would say the second one is just force yourself to do at least one thing every day that's going to drive new client growth. And again, I see a lot of people, they put together the big plans. I'm going to put together this campaign. I'm going to do this. I'm going to look at, well, but what did you do today? Well, nothing. Okay. Well, let's send out an email out to everybody on the list today. Let's pick up the phone and talk to two or three people who are in a position that they could bring me in as a speaker or bring me into their association, one thing or another. Let's just do something every day so that we're constantly making that kind of incremental growth.
I love that. Take action, right?
Yeah.
Take action. Just do and learn, right? Just do and learn. Um, Stephen, this has been just an incredible conversation. I mean, I think we could talk, and I think this happened during your podcast. I think we could
Yeah, we
talk
could go for
for
two.
hours,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we could make a Tim Ferriss style podcast and run for about 4 hours. But we're not going to do that today. But I would love to have you back and continue this conversation. And I know that there's a lot of people that are going to want to continue to hear it. Before I let you go, though, I always want to ask my two questions I ask all my guests. I am a lifelong learner. I love curiosity. I love to read books, and I love to learn through reading from people that are smarter than me, like yourself. So I always ask my guests, what's one book out there that you think, other than your book, which we talked about, but what's one book out there that you think everybody should read if they haven't, or reread if they've already read it once?
Oh, that's interesting. That's relevant to our business. I would say "Influence, Science, and Practice" by Robert Cialdini is. Um, over the holidays, I went on a reading jag where, when I was in Tulsa, we went to the museum for Black Wall Street, where the race riots were, which is very good. I'd recommend it to anybody. And I got interested in Booker T. Washington, so I read a couple of books on Booker T. Washington, and that got me interested in Frederick Douglass. So I'm reading a couple of books now on Frederick Douglass, and even that brings all kinds of interesting lessons about building celebrity and relationships. Frederick Douglass's relationship with Lincoln really was pivotal, and Booker T. Washington's relationship with Teddy Roosevelt was pivotal. But as far as something that's really practical, I would start with "Influence, Science, and Practice." To me, it's the best book ever written on the science of influence, and it teaches you the keys for building relationship, building credibility, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think there's something to be taken away from reading books outside of even our industry, right? Like you're talking about Booker T. Washington and Frederick
Yeah.
Douglass, etc. I just read *Sapiens*, and the
Yeah.
lessons learned. It's just so interesting to be outside of traditional books that I read. So stretch your
I have
limits, I
that one
think.
on my shelf too.
It's a phenomenal book, really fun read. The last question I want to ask, and we kind of talked about it for a little bit here, but we talked about a lot today, and I always like to leave everybody with one actionable thing that they could take away from our conversation. And maybe it wasn't directly that we talked about, but tangentially. What's one actionable piece of advice that you think everybody should take away that they can implement today or tomorrow and better themselves or their business, et cetera, going forward?
Well, I would say one is just stop giving up on prospects. So, what we see, a lot of advisors, they get a name of somebody who might be interested. They make at a run at them once or twice, and they give up on them. And the reality, we know some people are ready to work with you today. Others need a little bit of nurturing and education in 2 or 3 weeks. Others, it may be 2 or 3 years. And so I would recommend you communicate them with sending them your physical newsletter, your email, everything forever, right? I mean, I've had prospects where we never got them to do anything, but we got 3 referrals from them. So that's number one is just build a list. Online marketing, that's kind of the common thing. But when you build the list, make sure you're mailing to them, texting to them, emailing to them. But just maintain that communication all the time. I think the number two thing would be is don't expect that you're doing such a good job for your clients that they're just going to feed you people. You've got to be constantly communicating with your clientele, staying on the top, sending them your newest book, sending them the newest report, inviting them to a meeting, inviting them to a webinar, a Zoom meeting. You really need to be on the tip of your client's tongue and in front of them every day, every week, not a couple times a year.
I love that. That's such great poignant advice and something we can act on today. So I appreciate that, Stephen. As I mentioned, man, this has been such a fruitful conversation. I've loved it. I've learned a lot from it. I learned a lot from our conversation on your podcast, and so I'm sure everybody's going to want to continue to follow you, maybe get in touch to work with you. What's the best way for people to continue following your journey and get in touch with you?
Well, they can go to advisorwealthmastery.com. It has links to the podcast and YouTube channel and the books and all that stuff. So that's probably the best approach. So advisorwealthmastery.com. It's the Financial Advisor podcast. It's on YouTube and on all the podcast channels. And the book is on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or wherever.
Love it. Stephen Oliver, you're the man. I appreciate all you're doing for the industry. Appreciate your time here on Bridging the Gap, and hope to continue the conversation here soon. So stay well, be well, and thank you again, my friend.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.